entitled Moses Meets Pharaoh.
Moses Meets Pharaoh.
And as a result of his meeting Pharaoh, we'll find out that the burdens of Israel were increased rather than decreased. It must have been very difficult for Moses when God had selected him to be the leader, to go back to Egypt and to go to Pharaoh and tell Pharaoh, let my people go. You know, remember Moses made a lot of excuses as to why he was not to be the one to take on this tremendous task. But with every excuse that Moses gave, God gave him an answer for the excuse. And Moses was selected to be that leader. And along with his wife Zipporah and his son and his brother Aaron, who had come out to meet him, he makes his journey from the land of Midian back to Egypt to confront the Pharaoh and to tell the Pharaoh that God had said, let my people go. It's kind of interesting, as they left Midian to go back to Egypt, that God tried to kill Moses. Now that seems sort of strange, that as they were spending a night in an inn, the Bible says the Lord tried to kill him. And it was all over circumcision. When God talked to Abraham, he said to Abraham, beginning with his children, that is the children of Abraham, that the males would be circumcised as a sign that they were indeed God's people. And Moses had failed to circumcise his son. Now some have suggested, and I've read and heard actually people say, well, Moses may not have known that. But I'm sure Moses was very informed about the things that the children of Israel were to do and were not to do, because you may remember that his mother Amram was the one that took care of him until he was well up into years. And she did that for Pharaoh's daughter. And I'm sure that he knew about the things that concerned the children of Israel that were in the land of Goshen, although Moses grew up in the courts of Pharaoh, that he would have known about the activities of the children of Israel, and certainly he would have known that the children of Israel, that the males were circumcised. And so Moses' wife, Zipporah, she took a sharp stone and she circumcised her own son, who was at this time well up into years. And of course the Israelite babies were circumcised the 8th day. And she said to Moses, you become a bloody husband to me. And I've often thought about, why in the midst of the story of God is this place there? And I think it's to show us, as Paul was writing to the church at Rome, and he said that the things that were written aforetime were written for our learning. And that is that it is absolutely, without a shadow of a doubt, necessary that God's people follow God's law. I mean, no matter what. No matter if someone is selected, as Moses was, to be the deliverer of the children of Israel, that person who is a child of God must follow the law of God. There are no exceptions. That if you are a child of God, you must follow God's law. And so Moses violated the law of God in not circumcising his own son and following that which had been handed down to Abraham. God sends Moses to Pharaoh so that Moses could help God fulfill his promises that he had made to Abraham. That's the reason this story is in the Bible. The children of Israel were in Egypt because of a famine that had been in the land. Prior to the famine coming over the populated world at that time, circumstances presented themselves so that Joseph, being sold into slavery, was placed in Egypt. And God, being with Joseph, blessed him. And the blessings that Joseph received touched everything around him. And that's, to me, it's fascinating that with God's people, that the blessings that are received by the children of God blesses everything around them. When Joseph was even in prison, those who were his captors recognized that here was a man that God blesses. He had the ability to reveal the understanding of dreams. And it was because of this that Joseph ended up in the court of Pharaoh and then rose to the position of being only second to Pharaoh in the land of Egypt. And the Egyptian empire, and I say empire because it was an empire, the Egyptian empire was feared by everyone in the world in that day and time. They were a very powerful nation. The pharaohs who sat on the throne were viewed by the Egyptian people as being gods. I mean, the Egyptian people worshipped them just like they were a god. Historians tell us that they went so far as to literally say that the pharaohs sat in meetings with gods. You have to appreciate the audacity of Moses as he goes before this man who is presented there, who represents the nation of Egypt, and is viewed in the eyes of the people as being one of their gods. And Moses goes in with his command from God and says to Pharaoh, God says, let my people go. Now Pharaoh, as I mentioned, in the eyes of the public, is one of their gods. He is a son of Ra, the sun god. That's the way they viewed the Pharaoh. And so Moses goes in and he says to Pharaoh, God said, let my people go. And Pharaoh responds, as we would say in a very I really don't care attitude sort of way, who is the Lord that I, meaning Pharaoh, should obey his voice? This God, Moses, that you talk about, who is he that I, the Pharaoh, should obey his voice? Well, I'm a God myself. I mentioned in an earlier lesson that the Egyptians literally worshipped everything. They worshipped the Nile River. They worshipped the sun. They worshipped the moon. They worshipped the stars. They had names for all the gods that they worshipped, and they worshipped the whole creation rather than the Creator. All of the plagues that would be brought against the people of Egypt would be against their gods. And it would show that the God of Moses and the children of Israel was the true and living God. On one of the tombs that archaeologists uncovered of the pharaohs was this inscription in Egyptian hieroglyphics. The pharaoh in this tomb says, I am that which was, which is, and which shall be, and no man has lifted my veil. Now that's arrogant, isn't it? That's arrogant. That's the attitude of the pharaohs. And so he says to Moses, who is the Lord that I should obey his voice, that I should let Israel go? Who is the Lord? You know, Pharaoh did not have the right heart. And he did not, but he did rather, ask the right question. Who is God? Who is God? Is it the Nile River? Is it the sun that comes out in the daytime? Is it the moon and stars that appear at night? Is it the insects that fly around? You see, everything that the Egyptians did in their worship was an abomination to the children of Israel. Everything that the children of Israel did in their worship was an abomination to the Egyptians. You may remember in the Bible when Joseph's brothers came to be with him and they came to eat, they were put off by themselves. They were not allowed to eat with the Egyptians, and the Egyptians were not allowed to eat with them. Because the things that they ate, the two different groups, were an abomination one to the other. So in essence, they had basically agreed to disagree. But Egypt was blessed because of God being there in the presence of his people. And God was there in the presence of his people because he was fulfilling a promise that he had made to Abraham, and that is that your children will be numerous. They'll be like the stars in the heavens. They'll be like the sand on the seashore. And the Pharaoh said the Pharaoh that knew not Joseph said that when he saw how the people of Israel multiplied, he said, we're going to have to do something. They're going to rise up against us and overthrow us, and Egypt was a powerful nation. And so the conclusion was, we'll just make them slaves. And we'll just put them under harsh bondage. And we'll make them build our cities. Historically, the prosperity of Egypt was never better before or after like it was during the time that the Israelites were in Egypt. If you were to go to Egypt today and see all the ancient ruins, as they call them, the pyramids, the Sphinx, and all of these things, they were built during the time period in which the children of Israel were in Egypt. Many of the great discoveries of Egyptian history, which we today are just fascinated by, took place during this time. There were no major powerful cities built by the Egyptians after this period of time. Through the sweat, tears, and blood of God's people were these great cities built and these pyramids erected. Now what does that say? That says that God was blessing those who were around the children of Israel. And he did so because of his people being there. But now it's time to bring his people out so that he can fulfill another promise that he had made to Abraham. And that is to give unto Abraham and his children the land through which Abraham had sojourned. That God had called Abraham away from his family in the Ur of Chaldees. And he had told him to go into a land that I will show thee. And Abraham left his father's house, and with Sarah, his wife, they sojourned in the land of Canaan. And God said to Abraham, I am going to give you this land, even from Dan, which is as far north as you can go in the land of Canaan, to Beersheba, which is as far south as you can go. I'm going to give you this land, and to your children am I going to give it. At the time that Moses was there in Egypt, that promise had not been fulfilled. So now the time has come that God will bring his children out of Egypt, and he will lead them, if you please, into the promised land of their mind, that this promised land is going to be a land that God promised to them through their father Abraham. Interesting that the Hebrew writer in the New Testament, in writing about Abraham, said that he looked for a city which have foundation, whose maker and builder is God. You say Abraham only sojourned in the land. The only parcel of ground that Abraham even owned in the entire land of Canaan was the cave of Machpelah, where he buried his wife. It's the only parcel of ground that he owned. A place to bury his dead. But that entire land was promised by God to Abraham, for Abraham and his children. So Moses says, let my people go, and Pharaoh says, I'll not let them go. Not only will I not let them go because of idleness, they say, let us go and worship God. It's interesting that when Moses came to Pharaoh, he said, let my people go a 3 days journey into the wilderness that they may worship. And some people say, was Moses trying to be deceptive? Was he trying to deceive? Because that's not what God had said, that God's plan was. I mean, God had actually said that, but God's plan was for children of Israel to get out of Egypt. But it was to merely soften the heart of Pharaoh. If he wouldn't let them go 3 days, he's certainly not going to let them go entirely. And Pharaoh said it's because of idleness. And he said to the taskmasters, you go out and you take away their straw for building brick, and you say to them, you better not diminish the number of bricks that you make. As a matter of fact, you better make more. And you better put harsh punishment on them to make them make more brick. The taskmasters went out and they said to the people, you've got to make brick and you don't get straw. Archaeologists, in doing many of the excavations, have found just that. They found brick that contained straw. They found brick that contained stubble. They found brick that had no straw at all in it. Which perfectly fits the story of the Bible, because the Egyptians, in making brick, they were out trying to gather stubble in the fields, and they didn't have the straw, and they were making brick, and some of the brick didn't have any straw in it, and the taskmasters were on them saying, you're not doing this right, you're not filling the quota, you're not doing as you ought to do. And they were saying, it's not our fault, it's your fault, because you're asking us to make brick and you're not giving us straw. And the taskmasters were mocking them and saying, it's your fault because you're saying, let us go and worship, let us go and worship. And the people were then upset with Moses and Aaron. And they said, look what you brought on us. You've only made our lives harder. You promised, that our lives would be better, but you've made our lives harder. And it's interesting to me, instead of going to God and saying, God, help us, the children of Israel go to Pharaoh. They go to Pharaoh. And they say to Pharaoh, the taskmaster, they're telling us to make brick. We can't make brick. We don't have straw. We don't have what we need in order to make brick. And it's not our fault. It's their fault because they won't give us what we need. And the message comes back to Pharaoh, no, you're just idle. You want to go and worship. And if it means that you've got all this time to sit around and think up this kind of stuff, then that means that you've got more time to work. So go back and work and make brick. And so the people, they go and they cry, they don't cry to God, they cry to Pharaoh, the one who's persecuting them and bringing burdens upon them. It's interesting, how mankind is many times. In order to solve problems in his life, man, instead of turning to God, will turn to the devil. We'll think that people and things in the world can help them more than God can. But the help that they sought from Pharaoh was no help at all. Pharaoh said, you're idle and you need to go back and you need to make the brick. And they said, well, you put a sword in the hands of the taskmasters, and literally he had, because they were literally working the people to death. And Moses and Aaron received the blunt of the ridicule of the people because of what they had done. Because the people said, you have made us distasteful in the sight of Pharaoh, and you've made our burdens greater. The people had believed Moses when he came to them the first time, and I'm sure that there had been many rumors that had been going around that there would be a deliverer. Many of them surely through Aaron and his family believed that Moses would be that deliverer, especially when Moses killed the Egyptians that he saw hurting the children of Israel. But Moses had nowhere to turn, and Moses goes to God, and Moses complains to God about the problem. He says, Lord, why have you brought trouble on this people? Why is it? Why have you sent me? For since I came to Pharaoh to speak in your name, he has done evil to this people, neither have you delivered your people at all. Interesting, Moses didn't say, Lord, you hadn't delivered us. You haven't delivered my people. You haven't delivered your people, Lord. Lord, why have you brought trouble on these people? You know, Moses is a good example here of someone that's pouring out their heart to God and trying to understand what's happening in their life. But you may remember, though, that God told Moses it wasn't going to be easy. He told Moses that when you go to Pharaoh and you tell Pharaoh to let my people go. Now, this was back when he was on Mount Sinai and God was speaking to Moses through the burning bush. God said to Moses, when you go to Pharaoh and you tell Pharaoh, let my people go, he's not going to do it. It's only going to be by a mighty hand. And God said to Moses, I will stretch out my hand and I will strike Egypt with all my wonders, which I will do in the midst. And after that is, after I do all of my wonders, then he's going to let you go. Moses had forgot that. Moses, like most people, thought, it's just going to be easy. I'm going to go into Pharaoh. I'm going to say, God says, let my people go. I'm going to throw my rod down. My rod's going to become a snake. Moses is going to see that, and he's going to jump in line and going to let them go. It didn't work that way. Moses came in before Pharaoh. He threw his rod down. The rod became a snake. Magicians came out, threw their rods down. Their rods became snakes. You see, Pharaoh just thought this was some kind of parlor trick because his magicians could do that too. And he thought within himself, I'm a God. Who is this God that you're telling me that I need to obey his voice? Even though God had warned Moses that it wasn't going to be easy, Moses thought possibly that it was going to be. Why is it, Moses said, you sent me? In this tough time, the same old fears of Moses came crushing through. Why, Lord, did you send me to do this job? I'm not the man for the job, is what Moses was saying. I told you that back on Mount Sinai when I stood before the burning bush. I don't want to do this job. I'm not the man for this job. Why, Lord, are you doing this? You see, this was God's plan. This was to fulfill his promises that he had given to Abraham. God had given him his son Isaac. Through much turmoil on the part of mankind and Sarah trying to help out there by giving Ishmael to Abraham, and then Isaac being born, and then coming down and seeing the conflict there between Jacob and Esau, and then the things that went on with Joseph being sold into slavery. God was working out his plan. His children multiplied in the land of Egypt, and now God is saying, I'm working out my plan. But because of the harshness that's been placed upon the children of Israel, because of what the Egyptians had done to them, God was going to make them pay. He was going to make them pay. It was payback time. And when the children of Israel would leave Egypt, every god with a little g that the Egyptians worshipped would be brought to his knees. Everything that they held as deity would be destroyed because of the power of the true and living God. And it would not be until after that was accomplished that the children of Israel would leave Egyptian bondage and head home to the promised land. It wouldn't be until all that's fulfilled. And you know, it's the same way today with God and his promises. There are people who say, well, you know, why does it have to go through all this? I don't know. God is the one that designed his plan. He was the one that decided that Jesus would come to earth and give his life on the cross. He was the one that designed the church and how it would operate here on earth. He was the one that will decide how long this world that he has created will last. Back when Job was in tremendous pain, he asked God a lot of questions, you know, about the whys and the wherefores. Why does man have to suffer? Why do these things happen? As Moses here saying, you know, Lord, why did you choose me for this job? God's working out his plan. And when his plan is fulfilled, that's when the promises will be answered. You know, we don't always understand. Deuteronomy chapter 29 and verse 29 says the secret things belong unto God. We don't understand everything there is to understand, but God is working out his promises. Jesus said to his disciples, he said, I go away from you to my Father's house, which contains many mansions. He said, if it were not so, I would have told you. He said, I go that I may prepare a place for you. Just like the children of Israel in the Old Testament, and God made the promises to them, we have that promise that someday heaven will definitely be our home. And just as sure as God worked out his plans and his promises through the children of Israel, God will work out his promises and his plans through the church. If you're here tonight and need to respond to the invitation is yours while we stand and while we sing.